My name is Anna Whitmore, and if there's one truth I've carried since childhood, it's that some things are more than objects, they are the living echoes of the people we've loved and lost. For me, that truth was embodied in a small wooden chest tucked away in the corner of my mother's closet. The chest wasn't particularly grand. It wasn't carved with golden edges or locked with a heavy key. It was simple, a smooth walnut box with delicate brass hinges and a faint floral design engraved across its lid. But inside that chest was everything my mother valued most, her jewelry. Not the kind you buy to impress others, not the kind you flash in front of strangers at a dinner party, but the kind that carried memory, meaning, and love. There was the pearl necklace she wore on her wedding day, the sapphire ring she received when I was born, the tiny gold locket that held two miniature portraits, one of me as a child and one of her on her 16th birthday. Each piece told a story, and as a little girl, I loved sitting cross-legged on her bedroom carpet as she opened the chest and let me hold the pieces one by one. "Remember this necklace, Anna," she would say, brushing the pearls across her palm. "One day, you'll wear it, and when you do, I want you to feel me right here with you." She'd place her hand over my heart, warm and steady, and I believed her. My mother passed away when I was 23. It was sudden. Too sudden. A car accident, the kind of event that shatters a family in a single night. I was in my last year of college, halfway through my senior thesis when the phone rang. I remember the sound of my father's voice, hollow and trembling, when he told me she was gone. The days that followed blurred into each other, the funeral, the endless condolences, the casseroles dropped off by neighbors, the scent of lilies that seemed to cling to my clothes for weeks. But what I remember most vividly was the silence of the house once the guests left, once the phone stopped ringing. It was just me and my father then, and, for a while, it felt like we leaned on each other. He would sit at the dining table, nursing a cup of black coffee long gone cold, staring at nothing. I would sit across from him, pretending to read, just to keep him company. For months, grief bound us together, even if words often failed us. And then things changed. My father remarried. It was quick. Too quick, at least for me. Barely a year had passed when he introduced me to her. Margaret. She was younger than my father, though not by decades. A widow herself, she had a son from her previous marriage, Brandon, about my age. At first, I tried to be open. My father deserved happiness, I told myself. He deserved someone to sit with him at the table, someone to share the weight of mornings that still felt too quiet without my mother. But as the months went by, I began to notice subtle things that unsettled me. Margaret was polite, almost too polite. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and when she spoke, there was a precision to her words that made me feel less like family and more like an unwelcome guest she had to tolerate. She never mentioned my mother. Never asked about her. And whenever I did, I saw a flicker of impatience in her gaze, as though my mother's memory was an inconvenient shadow she wanted gone. It didn't take long before the jewelry chest became a point of tension. One evening, I came by the house for dinner. The air was thick with roasted chicken and rosemary, my father's favorite. I was in the kitchen, helping set the table, when I overheard Margaret speaking to him in the living room. "She doesn't even wear the jewelry, John," Margaret said, her voice low but sharp. "What good does it do sitting in a box? Brandon could put it to better use, the cufflinks, the watch. He has interviews coming up. It would mean something to him." My hands froze on the silverware. The air seemed to vanish from my lungs. She wasn't just talking about jewelry. She was talking about my mother's legacy, the only tangible reminders I had left. My father sighed. "It's complicated. Anna is attached to those things." "Attached?" Margaret scoffed lightly. "She's grown. She doesn't need trinkets from the past. You need to think about the family you have now, John. About fairness." The family he had now. The word cut like glass. I stepped into the room before I could stop myself. "They're not trinkets," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "They're my mother's. And they're not up for debate." Margaret's smile was thin, brittle. "Of course, Anna. I was only making a suggestion." But from that night forward, I felt the shift. The dinner invitations grew fewer. Conversations with my father always seemed to happen with her hovering nearby, watching. And each time I glanced at the jewelry chest, still sitting in the corner of the upstairs closet, I felt a gnawing unease that one day I'd go to open it and find it empty. That unease became reality sooner than I expected. It was on a Sunday afternoon when my father asked me to join him at his study. He was nervous, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. Margaret sat in the chair across from him, legs crossed neatly, her hands folded in her lap. "Anna," my father began, "there's something we need to discuss. Your mother's jewelry." "Margaret, and I believe," he paused, glancing at her before continuing. "We believe it would be fairer if some of those items went to Brandon. After all, he's family too now." My chest tightened. "Fairer?" I repeated. "How is it fair to take what Mom left for me and give it to someone else?" Margaret spoke before he could. "Your mother didn't leave a will, Anna. Your father has the right to decide what happens to her belongings. He wants what's best for everyone." I looked at him, searching for the father who used to sit at the dining table with me, who used to mourn with me in silence. But all I saw was hesitation, a man pulled by someone else's hand. "Dad," I whispered, "Mom wanted me to have them. She told me. Every piece has a story. You know that." He looked away. "I just want peace in this family, Anna." Peace. That word sounded hollow in his mouth. Because what he was really saying was, "I want Margaret happy, even if it means hurting you." I left that house that evening with tears burning my eyes and a storm building in my chest. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just fighting for jewelry. I was fighting for my mother's memory, for the love she poured into those pieces, for the promise she had made to me when she brushed her pearls across my heart. And though I didn't know it yet, this battle was only beginning. Because what Margaret didn't know, what my father didn't realize either, was that my mother had been wiser than anyone gave her credit for. She had left instructions. Quiet ones. Private ones. The kind that would surface when the time was right. But for now, all I had was silence, anger, and the gnawing question, how far would they go to take from me what was never theirs to begin with? I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old apartment pipes, my thoughts a storm I couldn't quiet. The image of my father sitting across from me, eyes lowered, parroting Margaret's words, looped in my head until it made me sick. My father, the man who once carried me on his shoulders at county fairs, who spent late nights checking my math homework, who cried silently beside me at my mother's funeral, had chosen someone else's comfort over his daughter's truth. But more than my father, it was Margaret's voice that haunted me. That polished, sugar-coated tone, the way she could lace poison into every sentence while smiling like she was offering kindness. She was clever. That much was clear. She hadn't marched in demanding the jewelry outright. She hadn't made herself the villain in my father's eyes. No, she wrapped her arguments in the language of family and fairness, slowly reshaping the way he thought until my mother's wishes seemed selfish and Brandon's wants seemed reasonable. It was manipulation at its finest, and it was working. The following weeks were tense. Every time I visited the house, I felt her presence pressing down on me. Margaret made sure of it. She greeted me with that brittle smile, offered me tea I never accepted, and slipped in little comments like, "You know, Anna, you'd be so much freer without those old things weighing you down." Or, "Brandon admires you. He says he hopes to be as responsible as you one day." She was always planting seeds, testing my reactions, studying me. My father, meanwhile, seemed to grow more distant. Our conversations became shorter, more cautious, as though he was afraid of upsetting her if he lingered too long with me. Sometimes I caught him watching me with something almost like guilt in his eyes, but it never lasted. Margaret was always nearby, her hand on his arm, her voice guiding him away. The breaking point came 2 months later. It was a Saturday, and I stopped by the house unannounced. I still had a key, though it felt more like a relic than a right. I walked upstairs to my mother's old room, driven by a sudden impulse to check on the jewelry chest. But when I opened the closet, my breath caught in my throat. The chest was gone. The spot where it had sat for years was empty, a faint square of lighter carpet the only proof it had ever been there. I felt panic claw at my throat. I searched the room, the dresser, even under the bed, but it was useless. The chest, my mother's chest, had vanished. I stormed downstairs, my voice sharper than I intended. "Where's Mom's jewelry?" My father looked up from the armchair where he'd been reading. His face tightened. Margaret appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her expression maddeningly calm. "Anna," she said smoothly, "there's no need to raise your voice. Your father and I agreed it was time to put the jewelry somewhere safer. We've locked it away." "Locked it away?" I repeated. "Where?" "It's not yours to move." Margaret's smile thinned. "Your father is head of this household. He has every right to decide how his late wife's belongings are handled." I turned to my father, desperate. "Dad, that chest is all I have left of her. How could you let it out of my sight without telling me?" He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "It's for the best, Anna. I don't want arguments about it anymore. This family needs harmony. Harmony. Always harmony." But it wasn't harmony they wanted. It was control. I left the house shaking with fury. The image of that empty carpet burned into my mind. The calls started the next day. My father rang me twice, leaving voicemails that sounded rehearsed, as though Margaret had coached him. "Anna, you need to understand, this isn't about taking from you. It's about unity. Please don't fight us on this." Then Margaret called herself, her tone sweet but laced with steel. "You're young, Anna. You don't understand what it means to run a family. One day you'll see that sacrifice is part of love. For now, trust your father." And then came the worst, a call from Brandon. His voice was almost sheepish, but smug underneath. "Look, Anna, I didn't ask for any of this. Mom thinks it's fair. If I do end up with some of the jewelry, I'll take care of it. It's not like it's going anywhere. Maybe one day, you'll thank me." Thank him. For taking what wasn't his. Family gatherings became unbearable. At Thanksgiving, Margaret wore my mother's sapphire earrings. The very ones my mother used to let me try on as a child, giggling when they dangled too big on my ears. When I saw them gleaming against Margaret's styled hair, my stomach turned. At Christmas, Brandon wore my father's old gold cufflinks my mother had saved for years to buy him on their 10th anniversary. He flaunted them, showing them off to relatives, basking in the praise of how sharp he looked. And my father, he said nothing. Not a word. Each moment was a dagger, a reminder that the chest I once guarded like treasure was now a stage prop for Margaret's new family. But here's the thing about daggers. The more they cut, the deeper the scar and the harder the heart beneath becomes. I stopped fighting openly. Stopped arguing, stopped begging. On the surface, I let them think they had won. I became quieter, distant, careful not to show my hand. Because somewhere deep down, I could feel it, a shift waiting to happen. Something my mother had left behind, something Margaret hadn't accounted for. And when that moment came, I promised myself I wouldn't just take back what was mine. I would make sure they understood what it meant to underestimate me. That moment arrived in the form of a letter. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, tucked in a stack of old files my father had sent me from the attic. Inside a yellowed envelope, addressed in my mother's handwriting, were 3 folded pages and a name that made my heart race: Mr. Harrison, attorney at law. I read her words again and again, my chest tightening with every line. She had known. She had planned. She had left instructions not in my father's care, but with her lawyer. And on those pages was the beginning of something Margaret could never touch. I sat back, clutching the letter, and for the first time in months, I smiled. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. The letter burned in my hands for days before I found the courage to act on it. I kept pulling it out of my desk drawer, reading my mother's careful handwriting until I could recite every word from memory. She had written it only a few months before the accident, almost as though she sensed her time was limited. It wasn't a formal will, not on its own. But it was a directive, addressed to her attorney, outlining exactly how she wanted her personal possessions handled if she passed unexpectedly. And there, in black ink that still carried the faint scent of her perfume, were the words that changed everything. The jewelry chest and all contents within are to be passed directly to my daughter, Anna Whitmore. No substitutions, no divisions, no exceptions. She had been precise. Deliberate. She had protected me in the only way she could. I called Mr. Harrison the next morning. The lawyer's office was lined with shelves of thick law books, their spines worn with age. Mr. Harrison himself was a tall, silver-haired man with kind eyes that seemed to carry decades of secrets. He remembered my mother well. She was a woman who thought ahead, he said, folding his hands across his desk. I told her at the time we'd file the directive with her estate records. She didn't want to upset your father then, so she kept it quiet. But now, given the circumstances, he tapped the letter gently. This carries weight, Anna. It can't be ignored. For the first time in months, I felt steady. Like I had my mother's hand on my shoulder again, guiding me. Can you make it official? I asked. He nodded. We'll set a date for a formal reading. I'll notify your father and his wife. They won't be able to avoid it. When the day arrived, I dressed simply but deliberately, a navy blouse my mother once loved on me, black slacks, and the small silver bracelet she gave me on my 16th birthday. It was the only piece of jewelry I had managed to keep out of Margaret's grasp, and I wore it like armor. The conference room at the law office was cold, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. My father sat at one end of the table, his shoulders stiff, his eyes shadowed with unease. Margaret sat beside him, her nails clicking against the polished wood as she drummed her fingers. Brandon leaned casually in his chair, smirking as though the whole thing bored him. I sat across from them, silent, steady, my mother's letter folded neatly in my lap. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of authority. We are gathered today to review the directives left by the late Mrs. Whitmore regarding her personal belongings. Margaret shifted, her chin lifting ever so slightly, as though she already anticipated victory. But then he read the words. He read every line of my mother's directive, clear and firm, his voice echoing off the walls. And when he reached the part about the jewelry chest, that it was to pass directly and entirely to me, I watched Margaret's smile falter, her color drain, her perfectly practiced composure crack like porcelain. That's absurd, she snapped, her voice rising. She didn't even leave a formal will. How can we take this seriously? Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses calmly. This letter was filed with her estate records and signed by her hand. Under state law, it carries legal weight. The jewelry chest and all contents belong solely to Anna Whitmore. There are no exceptions. My father swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between us. Margaret, he began softly, but she cut him off. No, I won't accept this. That jewelry was meant to be shared. Brandon sat up straighter, his smugness evaporating. Wait. You said Dad could. Enough, Mr. Harrison said firmly, his voice slicing through their panic. The matter is not up for debate. Mrs. Whitmore's wishes are clear. If anyone attempts to contest, I assure you the court will rule in Anna's favor. And such action may expose this family to scrutiny that I doubt you would want. The silence that followed was delicious. Margaret's lips trembled, her face pale with fury. Brandon stared at the table, his jaw clenched. And my father looked at me, really looked at me, as though seeing for the first time the daughter he had so easily dismissed. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My victory wasn't in rubbing their faces in it, it was in reclaiming what was mine, in honoring my mother's voice when they tried to silence it. That evening, I went back to the house. Margaret was gone, she couldn't bear to face me. Brandon had retreated into his room, slamming the door like a child. My father stood in the hallway, waiting for me, his expression heavy with shame. I should have protected you, he said quietly. I let her convince me of things I should never have allowed. I held his gaze, my voice steady. You let her erase Mom, Dad. You let her steal from me. That doesn't go away with an apology. His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost felt pity. But then I remembered the empty closet, the earrings on Margaret's ears, the cufflinks on Brandon's sleeves. Pity had no place here. I walked past him and climbed the stairs. In the corner of the upstairs closet, the jewelry chest sat once more, returned by order of law. I knelt before it, ran my fingers across the walnut lid, and opened it. The pearls gleamed softly under the dim light. The sapphire rings sparkled, untouched. The gold locket, my favorite, was still there, holding my mother's picture close. I pressed the locket to my chest and let the tears finally fall. Not tears of grief this time. Not of loss. But of vindication. Of justice. Margaret's power in the house crumbled after that. My father never admitted it outright, but I knew their marriage was never the same. Trust eroded, suspicion festered, and within a year, she was gone. Brandon followed soon after, leaving for a city job that never quite worked out. As for me, I kept the chest. I didn't lock it away in a closet. I kept it in my apartment, where I could see it every day, where my mother's stories lived on not as trophies, but as reminders. Each piece became a part of me, a silent promise that no one could rewrite my mother's love, no matter how hard they tried. And so, when people ask me why I fought so hard for just some jewelry, I smile and shake my head. Because they don't understand. It was never about gold or pearls or sapphires. It was about a daughter refusing to let her mother's memory be stolen. About standing firm when even my own father wavered. About knowing that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in screaming or breaking. It's in waiting, preparing, and letting the truth rise at exactly the right moment. Justice doesn't need noise. Justice needs patience. And when it finally came, it rang louder than any of Margaret's schemes ever could.